Hello and welcome to Drawing with Lee. I am Lee. I am the artist that will show you how to go from a rough outline of this adorable drawing of a puppy German Shepherd from the initial draft to a completed sketch. The nice thing about drawing is that you don't need that many tools to get started. As you can see here, I only have a couple items needed to complete this drawing. I have 2 charcoal pencils, an eraser, and here as well I have a kneaded eraser. So with some basic tools as well as some paper, we are able to teach any beginner how to take a drawing from beginning to end. And this is a great way to relax. It's something that you can provide as gifts to friends and family. Everyone loves a handcrafted piece of art that you made. And if you follow me from beginning to end, we can show you how easy it is to complete a drawing that your family and friends can cherish. Now, as you can see here, I have 2 different pencils. These are general charcoal pencils. They have been sharpened to a point. If you need clarification on how to sharpen a charcoal pencil, there are other YouTube videos available that can teach you how to do this. Generally speaking, use some kind of X-Acto blade to cut the wood from the pencil and then provide yourself about 1.5 inches, 2 inches of the lead exposed before you sand off the ends so that they go to a point. You want to make sure your pencils are super sharp so that you can draw very precise lines. This allows you to provide the best tools available to complete a polished drawing. In addition to that, I have 2 different erasers here. Here is a Factis BM2. It's a hard eraser that can be refilled. This is for erasing really difficult line work that needs to be removed. So if I make a more serious mistake, I can use this eraser to clean up those lines. The kneaded eraser is kind of the de facto flexible eraser. It's easy to kind of manipulate its shape. It can grab different pieces of charcoal bit by bit. So for finessing different marks on the page, you'll want to have one of these handy as well. The paper that I'm using today is a Strathmore 400 series drawing paper. Again, if you have other paper that you prefer, there are no issues whatsoever. This is just what I have available now, and I frequently use this as a decent base to complete a relatively polished drawing. Okay, let's begin. The first thing you must do when you begin a drawing is create some amount of an outline. So if you see my model here today, here's a photo of my German Shepherd when he was a puppy. And now I chose this photo because it's got a little bit of everything. He's got an adorable face, there's an interesting composition. This isn't necessarily strictly a portrait, but it's enough of a focus on his face that we will probably spend the majority of our time polishing that piece of the drawing. And on the other side of things, he also is horizontal in relation to the drawing paper that we have today, so will fit nicely in the space that is available within the paper. So to begin, I want to roughly sketch out the proportions of Cosmo here. Getting the proportions right is kind of the foundation to make sure when you start shading and you start polishing the shading and the finesse of the drawing is going to be accurate from that point forward. So let's start by sketching out his proportions. Now, the way I like to make sure that they're accurate is measure using a technique called triangulation. So at first I'm going to roughly kind of block in where I think he's going to take from a space perspective. You want to make sure that as you box in the proportions, that all the elements that you want to draw fit within the confines of your paper. You want to make sure that the resulting drawing isn't going to be too small relative to the canvas. You want to make sure that your subject doesn't exceed the boundaries of your paper. And don't be worried about making mistakes. Nice thing about lightly placing your subject on your paper is that if you notice something is disproportional, you can always fix it. May ask, how do you know if the lines you're drawing are accurately placed relative to the subject matter at hand? So the technique I want to show you today focuses on looking at large elements where you want to measure from. For instance, I want to make sure his furthermost left element of the body is his foot over here, and everything needs to be accurate relative to that. So if you look at that location and you measure kind of the angle between that element and say another element, which is his front right paw, you know that in relation to that, that paw must be on a line based on that measurement. So we'll do this thing for the entire drawing and ensuring that all the elements relative to each other can be accurately reviewed relative to each other by measuring the elements relative to the other elements. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. We expect you to make some maybe not the best choices in terms of the lines, but as long as you continue measuring, eventually the elements will be accurate. Now that we have a relatively accurate outline of the portrait, we can start refining the lines and finessing kind of the rough edges that were created to get things into place. For a portrait like this, you want to make sure you capture the essence of the pose and the facial expressions. So you'll probably spend a little bit more time working on making sure that major elements like the eyes and the nose are exactly where they want to be and showcase the expression that you are drawing from. Even if some things are not 100% proportional, or proportionally accurate, if you are able to capture the essence of the expression that is showcased from your subject, it gets you 90% of the way there. So the majority of the outlines are there. Let's just spend a little bit of time cleaning up all the measurement lines that we have at this point. I'm relatively happy with the general proportions. A lot of the lines are super rough. Let's just clean up the drawing before we start putting some value on the paper. Okay, so the foundations of this drawing are all there. We've laid out all the major components of the subject, the face, the various arms, and it may not be perfect, but the proportions are generally accurate. From here, what I generally like to do is to add a base layer of shading. Now, the interesting thing about this subject is that the way that the camera took this photo, it has everything sharp and in focus around the face, but the body of the subject is very much blurred out due to depth of field and the settings used to take the photo. Now, that may not be ideal in some circumstances because you lose all that detail in the background, but the nice thing about drawing from a photo like this is that where the subject's focus area is, the face is where we want to spend the majority of our time, whereas we can probably get by with making the areas that are out of focus also in a similar state within the drawing itself, because although you want all the pieces to be there, you still want the viewer of this drawing to be drawn towards the face, the focal area of this drawing. So from this point on, the interesting thing about this subject is the face is well lit and very expressive, and a big part of Cosmo's body is actually very dark. Now, parts of the darkness is in deep shadow while others are actually a bit lighter. The interesting thing about drawing here is that you can begin with a base layer of shading that can be applied evenly across all the darker areas of the photo and then enhanced later by bringing the lighter areas forward but also the darker areas darker. And that will provide you with a certain amount of dynamic range that allows the drawing to eventually pop. So let's get started by layering in the base layer that gives you the ability to foundationally set where the highlights and the shadows are and provide you with the ability to take that to the next level upon eventual completion. So one technique I like to use when shading is using a single direction for the initial layer of shadow that is being added to the subject. This provides an even quality to how the charcoal is laid onto the paper and reduces the gaps that exist between the paper and the lead that is being applied. That doesn't mean that the shading is perfectly even, but it gives you a good foundation for adding more shadow with a softer pencil later, or using your kneaded eraser to reduce the values on some of the more mid-tone areas of your drawing. Now, looking at this drawing, I noticed that the ears are definitely too large for the subject. So it's never too late to really make those adjustments as you see issues with the drawing. Don't be afraid to change things as you see mistakes. Mistakes are a part of any drawing, and no matter how much experience you have, sometimes you just don't notice things until you get to a certain point within the drawing. And that's okay. The only important part is to try and catch that as early as possible, because the darker the line work is, the harder it is to make those corrections without leaving imprints on the drawing. You could also say that sometimes that adds character to these drawings. And as you shade over your mistakes, they will become less prevalent and obvious in the final work that you come out with. We have successfully completed the first layer of shading. Even though we have mostly been consistent about the value scale here, some of the darker elements are darker than some of the lighter elements, and it's already beginning to showcase the direction that this thing is going in. Okay, now that we have the foundational shadows into place, we'll start pushing those values and getting more into the darker areas so that the drawing begins to pop. As you're shading, make sure that you keep a light touch. So far, we have only been using the 1 HB pencil. We haven't even started using the darker, softer 2B yet. This gives us a way to push some values without getting too dark too quickly, in case we want to fix or change anything. Also, the nice thing about the harder HB pencil is that it grabs onto the paper really nicely. So if you can cover the page with the lead from the harder pencil, it will be easier to then darken it with a softer pencil like the 2B or 3B in the future, without leaving weird gaps in the paper that you'll have to fill in anyway with the harder pencil if you want to have consistent texture in your drawing. The other important thing about shading values is take your time. Now, I'm sort of going through this relatively quickly. I would probably, if I was drawing this in a non-demo format, take my time a little bit more when it comes to how quickly I go through the shading process. The idea here is to be relaxed and almost be in a meditative state while you're drawing. Look at your photo reference and just slowly work your way through the drawing. There is no rush here. The quieter your mind is while going through this process, generally the calmer the effects of your mind on the quality of the drawing as you complete the process. Sometimes you will notice that there are sections of this drawing where I may accidentally make too dark relative to the areas surrounding it. That's just inevitable given your level of pencil control the average person has. Now, obviously there are some experts out there that could easily shade and make sure everything is absolutely perfect, but for the vast majority of us, we end up with little blemishes or darker areas than we wanted to apply. So whenever those happen, you can easily go in there with a kneaded eraser and erase those out and then reshade it in, and it will look as if that never happened if you go through that process of healing the section of the paper where there may be an indent or some kind of blemish that makes it a lot easier to pick up the lead. You want to use your kneaded eraser to fix those areas so that the values are relatively consistent in the area that you're trying to add additional shadow to. It's a constant push and pull of lead with eraser to kind of get you to the value that you would like across the entire drawing. as you shade a subject like this one, you want to remove the hard edges around fur. So here, where I had lines indicating where his fur ends, I'm going to slowly erase some of those hard edges and replace them with more of a shadow that softly goes into the background. So it looks like more of a fur texture that would be natural for any animal that does not have exposed skin. Now, so far, the vast majority of the shading that I have done has been vertical up and down. A lot of that has to do with just simplicity of applying an even value where desired, which is easier to do if you are doing it unidirectionally. But now that the base layer is on and we want to take the shadows to the next level, I will start using a technique called cross-hatching, which is applying the pencil in the shade in other directions, which will allow the paper to grip onto more area of the pencil, effectively allowing it to go darker and darker. This is also where I will start using a softer pencil to apply to the darker areas so that you can continue to push the boundaries of the shade. And you'll see that it's a lot easier to apply using the softer pencil. But also, as you apply the softer pencil, you'll see these gaps that are created. And the easiest thing to do is to come in here with the harder HB or equivalent pencil to fill in those gaps so it does not look like there's spaces in the shadows. Now, I just broke my pencil there, but whenever something like that happens, it always reminds me that it's important to keep your pencil sharp. And sometimes when we're drawing, it can be really easy to forget to stop and fix your tools. But if you stop more often and and sharpen your pencils and make sure everything is in the best possible condition possible, your work will ultimately show for it and be improved because you spent a little bit of time just taking a break. Now, one technique that you can use here is for trying to blend fur textures. You can use Kneaded Eraser almost to back out values and give it some fur-like indentations of highlights that give it a more realistic look. Again, this entire process is like a push and pull of textures and values, and you just continue to go through this process of bring in the shadows and then bring out some of the highlights till you eventually get to a finished looking drawing. Now the thing about drawing is that you have to make a decision on how much polish you want to apply to the final drawing. Especially with something like this, a significant portion of the body is really the background, right? So even in the source photo, The shallow depth of field provides very little clarity around details surrounding the back of the puppy's body, which is good because it means that we can focus on the parts of the drawing that matter, namely the face, where you want the viewer to focus on, draw an attention to. And that's where we want to spend maybe a little bit more time finessing, making sure it pops in the way that we want it to. Whereas, at this point, the back of the puppy, there may be some little details we want to add in, but mostly the values are there and it suffices for what we want to convey to the viewer of this piece of art. It is good enough, right? Maybe a little bit of cleanup left, but overall, the major components are there, and because the viewer is not really focusing on those areas and really cares about the quality of the face, we want to spend the rest of our time making sure that this is in the best shape possible. The face is in the best shape possible. The other decision that artists have to make is really how much polish do we want before we say a drawing is really done. I'm sure many of you have seen demonstrations or drawings that are hugely detailed, almost photorealistic in results, especially when using a graphite pencil or a series of graphite pencils. You can really get pretty granular with the quality of values and get it to a really finessed, polished state. Now, I question whether or not that's necessary for the majority of drawings. What you really want to capture is a likeness and an expression that looks of a specific quality that you're trying to express as an individual artist. And that can be more or less done or photorealistic in a sense, but more important than not, you want to capture the essence that you're trying to convey. And maybe something like this is as far as you want to take it. Before you consider it complete. So that's a decision that every artist has to make for themselves. At what point have you captured the essence of what you set out to do to begin with? And there isn't a single straight answer for when that is. There may be days when you feel like you want to take a drawing to a more completed state because of the subject matter, or there are days when a rough sketch is what you're going for. And even though there may be less value in the variations of shadows and line work in those cases, you may still be satisfied with the expression in the artwork that you accomplished. So play around with it. Like everything else artwork-wise, it's a personal decision. Today's day and age, there really isn't a right or wrong answer. Just as the way that I'm showing you how to draw isn't for everyone. And this is the technique that works for me, but different, even well-trained draftsmen and artists have their own preferred techniques. And what I showed you here is just one method, one approach that works for me that may be helpful for some of you as you go through this journey of becoming a better drawer. Okay, and there we go. I've taken this drawing as far as I would like to, and although there are some areas that are a bit more abstract, a bit more blobs of shadow, the essence of Cosmo is in this drawing, and I hope you enjoyed this demo. If you like this, please give me a like, and if you love this, please subscribe to my channel. It really helps me to want to do more of these. I plan on doing a series of portraits, other animal drawings in the future, so if you subscribe, you'll be the first to know